Okay, so during this protest era, one of the main issues of protest was the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War affected Mexican Americans in a number of significant ways, right? For one, the Vietnam War took funding away from the war on poverty. We talked about this earlier. The war on poverty was directing funds towards the Mexican American community, helping to fight issues of poverty. But funding for these programs would be reduced because funding was needed for the Vietnam War. Right, and so a number of Mexican Americans were angry about this, right, and so that was an issue. Another big issue was that Mexican Americans were not really able to get deferment from the draft, right? So there was a draft for the Vietnam War, right? Young people were being drafted into the military to fight in the war. But many Anglo Americans were able to get out of the draft because they were going to universities. If you were a student at a university at this time, you could get deferred from the draft and you wouldn't have to join the military. Other Anglo Americans benefited from having jobs that qualified them for deferment. And so Mexican Americans were not able to get these deferments because many were not going to universities at this time. And so large segments of the Mexican American community were targeted for these drafts and ended up going to war. Right? And many of them died on the front line in Vietnam, right? The number of Mexican American casualties was a much larger proportion than it was for Anglo Americans who were fighting in the Vietnam War. And so this was a big issue. Project 100,000, a U.S. program that lowered the requirements for joining the military and being involved in the draft, was another factor that led to more and more Mexican Americans being drafted into the war, which increased their number of casualties. And so the Chicano movement started to focus more and more on protesting the Vietnam War. Okay, the National Chicano Moratorium Committee was an organization that came together to plan a massive protest that would take place in Los Angeles in 1970. The Brown Berets, an organization that was involved in a number of civil rights issues, played a major role in organizing the Chicano Moratorium. And so this would lead to a massive protest that took place on August 29th in 1970. And so thousands were involved in this protest. There was a march that took place in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, the police got involved and there was fighting that took place between the police and demonstrators. And eventually the police started attacking the demonstrators. Many suffered injuries. A couple of individuals were killed. A Mexican-American journalist named Ruben Salazar was one of the fatalities during this attack on the Chicano War Moratorium protest. Salazar had been heavily critical of the police there in Los Angeles. He was writing about police brutality, speaking out on these issues, and it was believed that he was actually targeted. The police were firing tear gas at the demonstrators, and a tear gas can hit Ruben Salazar, who was sitting in a cafe at the time, and he died because of this. And so it was believed that he was actually targeted by the police and murdered because he was speaking out against the police there in Los Angeles, right? But ultimately, the Chicano War Moratorium was a massive protest speaking out against the Vietnam War. Several months later, the moratorium would hold another march, and again, the police would get involved and would be attacking the demonstrators, right? And so this was one of the major events that took place during the Chicano movement in the protest era.